Welcome to Pascal's China Lens, and the answer I'm going to give on this week's question comes from Delphine de Smet, who wanted to know if China is back to normal. So is China back to normal is the question to answer today. And to understand that, we have to look at the last 6 months. We're about 6 months after the lockdown in end of January in Wuhan. And what we see is that China, through those 6 months, had almost a V-shaped recovery. So the first part was really everything was in lockdown, was stopped, no factories were running, you couldn't see the retail opened, there were no travelers or scheduled flights, everything stopped in China up to March, even part of April sometimes. And so this created an environment that everything was down. Look at GDP. China's GDP was down 8.4% in the first quarter. If you know that China expected to grow at 6% in 2020, I mean, going down at 8.4%, it's an incredible downsizing of the economy. Now, the second quarter, actually, China was growing at 3.2%. That means that for the first half of this year, China had a decline of 1.6%, which isn't fantastic, but compared to other countries anywhere in the world, this is an enormous difference. And it's the first country in the world that is actually growing again. So we could expect by the end of 2020 for the whole year a growth of about 2 to 3% in China, which is actually quite well. It's half of what they expected, considering this pandemic. Most other countries, they're down at 10 to 15% in the world. And on average, we're talking about more than 5% decline in the whole world. Now, I'm going to give you some numbers to understand each of these industries and what's happening. If you look at manufacturing and non-manufacturing index, the PMI, like we say, it's already above 50. What that means is that factories are running again, the industry is back on track, and things are growing again. That's all recent since July. Now, if we look at things like exports were way down in the first quarter. Today, exports are actually going back in July at 0.4% on year. It's actually June. So June was 0.4%. So it's back on track. And a lot of it had to do, of course, with the masks and the medical equipment that was shipped. And so the factories were running to support the world with medical supplies. But that is slowing down now, but it looks like the exports are back on track, which means that the trade war, which is what Trump really tried to fight with China on, didn't have such an effect on China. Now, when it comes to imports, China is actually growing quite well at 2.7%. Now, let's look at retail for a minute. If you look at retail, the first 2 months, January, February, it was down at 20.5%. Huge impact. Like everywhere else in the world, retail was shut. And so 24.5% actually decline in the first 2 months. Now, since then, if we just look at the last months of June and July, June we had 1.8% decline. July we had 1.1% decline compared to a year ago. What that means is that we're almost back at growth in physical retail. If you look at online retail, e-commerce, it's actually growing back at 15.7% last month. So that's really doing very well. So China's retail is back on track and e-commerce is growing. Now, the big issue in China is unemployment. Like everywhere else in the world, lots of people lost their jobs. We're talking about 125 million people in the urban areas that lost their job during the lockdowns and after the lockdowns. We estimate about 25 million will be permanent that will have lost their jobs. The Chinese government wants to recover 9 million jobs this year, so we're still talking about 15 million people that will have lost their jobs because of this crisis. But that doesn't even put into account or take into account the migrant workers that also have lost their jobs. And that could be about 25 million people as well. So lots of people that lost their job. That's not a good thing about what's happening in China, but it's a global issue. But everything else seems to be back. So what's really back? If you go outside, you look at the traffic is congested like before. Everything is normal. The coal production is at the same level. If you look at property sales, people are buying again. So a lot of indications that the economy is back on track since the summer. Now, what isn't completely back on track are things like the flights. People are traveling less. They're still cautious to go to certain areas, there's few areas which are still infected, and they're trying to travel less in general. Also on the subway, they're traveling less, they're going less to restaurants, and there's also not going to the cinema again as much, which is open again, but it's like at 30% capacity allowed. Now, I believe that most of these changes is more because of a change of habits than actually a change of the economy. People don't want to travel as much. They've learned to work remotely. They don't want to go to cinemas. They've learned about streaming more. And they also don't take the flights when it's not necessary anymore. So it's a habit change. So I believe the economy itself is actually back on track. And so if you would look at the infections today, so that's the real question. Is it back to normal when it comes to the virus and the spreading of the virus? You almost don't see it. Now, back in June, there was a worry about a second wave in Beijing, but we're talking about a little bit more than 300 people that got infected. But instantly, the Beijing government closed off a whole area, put everybody in lockdown, thousands of people, volunteers helping to maintain that lockdown. And so there were very serious instant measures. And so a second wave didn't happen. I actually don't believe China will ever get a second wave because they'll have a vaccine before anything big would come out again. So there are still some pockets in Xinjiang where we're talking about 10 to 20 to 30 people infected every day, every new day. But they quarantine Urumqi, the main capital of Xinjiang, very quickly. And so no, we don't see this. So people don't behave as if there's a second wave. They do still are cautious. They wear masks. They also wash their hands. They keep some distance. But in some places like shopping malls, some restaurants, you don't really feel that there's a pandemic. So if you would be going to China for the very first time and you would look at China, you wouldn't believe there's been a pandemic at all. And so I think China is really back to normal. And that means that from the economy point of view, China will probably be 6 to 18 months ahead of a back to normal to any country in the world. And that will have given China 1 year of lead time. So if we want to look at how China's new business model, new innovations, new incentives, new things that are created in China could be inspiring us for how we will be coping with that or dealing with that after our corona crisis, I think China is really the best place to look at today. Thanks to have listened to this longer answer on the question whether China is back to normal. So see you next week for another episode of Pascal's China Lens.